Hi, today we're going to take a look at some quadratic graphs again, which we call parabolas, but we're really going to focus on the features of some of the things that we see on a parabola. So our learning target is I can identify the key features of a quadratic function using technology. The day 3 assignment in Schoology for you to take a look at, and we'll be using Desmos.com again as our graphing calculator. So starting with some vocabulary, when we talk about quadratic graphs, just a reminder that we have the shape called a parabola, which is a U-shaped curve that's symmetric on the left and the right. The parabola that I just drew would have a minimum value. A minimum is the lowest point on the parabola that if the parabola opens up, and we consider that to be the lowest y value. So that lowest point would be right there at the bottom of a parabola that opens up. If we have a parabola that opens down, like this one, it would never have a minimum or a lowest point because those arms continue down forever. They never end. So instead, a parabola that opens down has a maximum or a highest point on the parabola. And we can identify the minimum or the maximum by its y value or y coordinate of that point. Now the vertex is actually that same point, but the vertex is the entire ordered pair that makes up the x and the y coordinates of that point. It also happens to represent the maximum or the minimum as we just talked about. Think of it as the middle of the parabola. And last but not least, we have the axis of symmetry. It's an equation for the line of symmetry that goes through the vertex of a parabola. So it's always going to be a vertical line, and we usually use a dashed vertical line to show the axis of symmetry, or sometimes called the line of symmetry. And again, it goes right through the vertex, which is at the middle of the parabola, and it splits my left side and right side into two halves, keeping in mind that it's symmetrical. The left side and the right side are mirror images of each other, and that line represents the midpoint. So let's look at a few graphs here where we have some coordinates to work with. And the graph on the left, we see that it opens down. We have a highest point on the parabola, and the highest point is at our vertex, which happens to be a maximum because it's the highest possible y value along the parabola. Now for the vertex, we want to give the coordinates of that point. So as we look at our vertex, which is right here, I just put a blue dot on it. If you follow that down to the x-axis, we see that it crosses the x-axis at 1. So it has an x coordinate of 1. If we follow it over to the y-axis, we can see it has a y coordinate of 4. So the coordinates of the vertex are at 1, 4. The axis of symmetry is that line that goes right through the vertex. And because it's a line, we can write an equation to represent that line. All vertical lines can be represented as x equals a number, and that number comes from the value of where the line crosses the x-axis. Since that axis of symmetry goes through the x-axis at 1, my equation for the axis or line of symmetry is x equals 1. For my y-intercept, I can see it marked on the graph, and using my numbers, I can tell that it's halfway between 2 and 4. My y-intercept has a value of 3, but I'll list it as the coordinate 0, 3. Let's do the same thing for the other graph here that opens up. The only difference this time is because the graph opens up, or the parabola opens up, the vertex is actually a minimum. But the coordinates of the vertex are still x and y coordinates. So the lowest point, my minimum down here, let's see, has an x coordinate of -1 if I follow it up to the x-axis. And if I follow it over to the y-axis, that would be at -3 using the clues from the graph. My axis of symmetry then, remember that's always going to be x equals a number. And that number comes from wherever my line, my axis of symmetry line, crosses the x-axis, which is right there at my blue dot, and that would be -1. My y-intercept is marked on the graph, and I can see that my y-intercept is right on the y-axis at -2. So we're going to mark that as 0, -2 for the y-intercept. Now what I want to point out is that the x-coordinate of the vertex is going to be the same number as what we see in the axis of symmetry equation. That's not a coincidence. That's always going to be what it is, because the x-coordinate of the vertex is always going to be in line with the axis of symmetry, because the vertex is right in the middle of the parabola where the axis of symmetry goes. So those numbers will always be the same. All right, next we're going to use Desmos to help us graph the quadratic function, and we'll identify if the parabola opens up or down, if it has a minimum or a maximum. We'll find the equation for the axis of symmetry, the coordinates of the vertex, and the coordinates of the y-intercept. So let me get Desmos opened up here and make it a little bit smaller. And let's start by typing in our equation. Y equals x, and then I want to get the exponent here, so I click the a squared button, plus 2x minus 1. Make sure my equation matches what I wanted it to be, and I can see my graph pictured here. All right, so looking at our parabola, we can tell very clearly that this parabola is going to be what we call opens up, because the arms of the parabola continue upward. We can think of it as it's more like a cup where you fill the cup. Okay, it opens up. Because it opens up, that means we have a lowest point here down at the bottom of the parabola. So this would be a minimum y value. So I'm going to start by marking that it opens up and it has a minimum value. Now for the equation for the axis of symmetry, as a reminder, it is going to be x, try that again, x equals some number wherever it crosses the x-axis. So let's go back to our graph. We can see here, it's not going to give us our dotted line like we had on the last page, but we can see the vertex is at -1, -2. So the axis of symmetry is going to go straight through the x-axis from there, which will be right at -1. And like we talked about on the last page, we saw that if the vertex has an x-coordinate of -1, the axis of symmetry is going to be x equals -1. So you can kind of think of it as, oh yeah, the x value is -1, so x equals -1 is your equation. Last we have is our y-intercept. Let's go back to our graph, and we can see that it crosses the y-axis right there. Remember, it's wherever your graph or your curve crosses the y-axis, and it's at the point 0, -1. Now that's a coincidence that it is -1. That is not because of the -1 appearing here. Okay, so that's going to be a little bit different. All right, so just to recap there, we typed in our equation. We let Desmos do the hard work for us of graphing. And if I click on my line or my parabola, I can start to see some of those key features. We have our vertex here at the bottom, which we know is a minimum because it's the lowest y value that's possible. That's the lowest y value of -2. There aren't any points below on the y-axis. anywhere along this curve. It opens up. The equation for the axis of symmetry, because your vertex is -1, -2, the line of symmetry is x equals -1, okay, because it's going to go straight through here. And then your y-intercept is 0, -1. Let's do the same thing for one more example. Here we have a different equation. If you feel like you're up to it, you could go ahead and try this on your own, pause the video, and come up with your, I'm going to do that, come up with your answers to these 5 questions, and then play the video to see how you did. All right, so taking a look at our parabola here in blue, we can see this time our parabola opens down because the arms of the parabola are reaching downward. That means that it's going to have a highest point. We call that the maximum here. The maximum y value is +2. It never gets higher than that for a y coordinate. My vertex is at 2, 2. My y-intercept is 0, -2. And my axis of symmetry is going to go right through that highest point, that vertex. And because that would cross the x-axis at 2, my equation for the axis of symmetry will be x equals 2. All right, let me just double check and make sure that I wrote those down correctly. And I think I did. 0, -2 is the y-intercept. The vertex was 2, 2, meaning my axis of symmetry is x equals 2. It's a maximum because there's a highest point on the parabola, and it opens down because the arms of the parabola reach downward. All right, you are all set for your practice assignment in Schoology. Please open up Unit 10, Day 3, and good luck.